Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this A-Level Dirt feedback on carbon inquiry question 2. And as always, it's really important you've got the marks for your work sent back to you. Make sure that you do go through your answers that you've written down or put onto Firefly, and then make sure you also consider the sample answers that I've given you and the other feedback to try and work out why are the marks missing and what would you need to include next time to make sure that you can improve your understanding of the topic, but also your exam technique as well. So here we have the examples of the questions that we went through for inquiry question 2. As always, you can stop this video to make notes and to add some of the comments to your work, but also it is important that you use this opportunity to help develop your understanding, to make sure then that you've got a good knowledge and understanding of the whole of the A-level course, and because we're nearing the end of the course, begin to see how everything links together. Not only between the different topics, but also between the main overarching themes of players, futures, and actions as well. So there were no real problems with this first question, define the terms energy mix. The one thing I would say, just to make sure that you get those full marks, is make sure that you do give some examples in there as well, rather than just the definitions. And so some of you I've marked down just to 3 marks, just to encourage you to put the examples in, which just helps to show your knowledge and understanding of that, just in case your definition is a little bit unclear. So question 2, explain why the levels of economic development affects the energy mix of countries. So it was really important to look at different levels of development, from low developed countries, emerging countries, and more higher income countries as well. You can see on the screen here that you've got some of the different answers that could have been given. It could have been this idea that developed countries have more money to invest in a wider range of energy types to develop their energy mix. Poorer countries may lack the resources to exploit some of the harder to reach energy mixes, or if they have a large supply of coal, such as India or China did, then they tend to rely on that initially. But one of the common areas was writing less developed cannot develop their renewable energy like solar. For example, in some nations, particularly those areas which have communities which are spread out, it can be easier for them to develop the small-scale solar and water power than it can be to invest in traditional fossil fuel power stations, which then require large-scale transmission lines and transmission networks. So if you have a look at some of the Aecon Lighting Africa, the fact that they've done small-scale community-led solar generation as a way to overcome the issues of energy supply. But again, that then relies still on just one type of energy rather than a diverse energy mix, which is required for energy security. Now you can see on this page and on the next page, I've got 2 examples of really good answers. They're both very different. There are some literacy errors in there and incorrect capital letters in there. But I just want you to focus on the geography. So what you can do is pause the video, read through, and then what are the good points on it? Can you see how these would have got their 6 marks? So you can pause it, then play it a little bit to see the next one, and pause and read through that one as well. So question 3 looked at the different players in securing pathways and supplies. Most of you did well, although a large number of you did forget about consumers. And there were some common errors. Many of you stated that TNCs and energy TNCs were state controlled. There are very few of those. The government, as you can see on this information here, they make the key decisions in terms of the energy mix that they want to use. They want to make sure they've got energy security for their people. And while there are some TNCs which are state-owned, like EDF in France, a large number of the TNCs are now private companies. And it is important that you also recognise the role of consumers, whether they be domestic or industrials, but also recognise that these are key players but often have very little influence in there. So here you can see a solid example. It talks about the different players who are involved. So we've got the TNCs, the governments, then we've got the consumers, and it also clearly talks about the role of the extraction, the development, and the transportation of it as well. And it does say they can be private companies or state-owned, but it doesn't make that common misconception that most of them are. So it's very important that you do take care of your wording on that. So explaining the ways in which pathways can be disrupted. If you're looking at 6 marks, you're really wanting to be discussing 3 different pathways, to be fair. And you want to talk about a different number of ways in which they can be disrupted. You don't just want to talk about political relationships for all 3, which, while relevant, you want to give a range of different pathways and a range of different ways in which they can be disrupted. So you can see we have them on here, and then again you've got 2 more answers which follow, which you can pause through and have a look. But what is also good is the use of geographical evidence of different locations where these have happened, which really show at A level the level of development and understanding. And again, you can see here a very different answers, and it covers 2 or 3 of the main different ways, but they have different ways in which those pathways can be disrupted as well. And here we can see, just in case you don't have them in your notes, here are just some of the examples of the different disruptions to pathways that you could be using, and just to help develop your understanding and knowledge, and case studies that you could include in your answers. Now again, with this one explaining the impact of changing global consumption of fossil fuels on the carbon cycle. And this was an exam question, and you can see some of their comments that they wanted to see in there. But it was important that you didn't just talk about moving it from the geological slow store and then putting it into the atmosphere. That was far too simplistic. It's also good if you can include a few of these statistics as well. For some of you, only getting the 5s out of 6s, your understanding is good, but could you have had and added in that little bit of extra detail which shows that you're working at the very top of the A-level standard? So this is the first of 2 answers you can have a look at, which were very, very strong. And you can see it's talked about the direct impact of fossil fuel burning. It's then talking about linking it into the atmospheric store and how it's moved it from the lithosphere. It's then talked about how it links in with the oceanic sequestration, and so it's gone wider than just into the atmosphere. And then it's talking about some of the feedback mechanisms as well. So it's really going and extending the answers and just showing how everything can have a knock-on effect. Similarly, on this one, it has mentioned some of those other knock-on effects, because when you put more carbon into the atmosphere, that also has a knock-on onto the oceanic or hydrosphere, but it also has an impact onto the ecosystems and the biosphere. One area that was perhaps missed was soil. Although you do have to be very careful and make sure you do stay focused on the question. What's good about this as well is recognizing futures. This idea that fossil fuels may decrease and therefore it may reduce some of the pressure on that. But you do have to be careful that you make sure that you keep it focused on the question itself. It's only 6 marks. You don't need to say everything that you can. Just think about it. Have I made 3 clear points which are really well explained and developed? Again, this answer was generally done pretty well. You all understand about the different types of unconventional fossil fuels, what they are, and the costs and benefits of them. Now, some of you took the approach of talking about tar sands, then oil shale, then shale gas, which is fine, and you could still have got 5 or 6 marks. But what you could have done is try to write it in a much more mature way. You could have given the general cost and benefits. So the general cost is it's still a fossil fuel, so releasing carbon into the atmosphere. There's also a lot of environmental damage in the extraction of them as well. And then start to introduce some of the specific impacts and some of the specific examples in there as well. And this is a really good example of just doing that. A brief introduction of what unconventional fossil fuels are, some of the overall benefits to them, because the benefits are all very similar for all of them. But then we start to talk into the tar sands, and deep water oil as well, with some specific information in there which is required for those high marks at A level. So again, pause it through, have a look, what do you notice? How could you improve your own answers by looking at the answers on here? And this is very similar, the impacts of using alternatives to fossil fuels. So again, you could just go through each of different types, giving the costs and the benefits, or you could lump some of them together, recyclable, renewable energies, giving some of the costs overall, some of the benefits overall, and then giving some specifics. One of the common errors, though, is that the cost is always higher for renewables. But we've seen in recent years that now the costs for solar and wind power in particular are much more aligned to traditional fossil fuels, and in some areas costs are actually coming down because of the improvements in technology and efficiency of these types of energy. And also one thing to bear in mind, although not for this question, is that when you're talking about fossil fuel energy, it doesn't take into account the externalities, the costs such as carbon release, because they're not taxed effectively. So actually you could say that the fossil fuels have been unfairly cheap because we're not taking into account all of the actual costs, which include the pollution that's involved with them. And again, another chance for you to have a look at a really, really strong answer that looks at the renewable and recyclable. Please try and ignore some of the errant capital letters that appear in the middle of sentences. But again, you can see that it has linked them, the benefits and costs together. It's noted some exceptions to them, but it's given a whole range of different examples. But it's concise, it's short, and it's just relevant to the question. So really, really strong answer on that one. And same again for this one. The use of a very brief introduction, but splitting them up into renewable and recyclable is a really good way of showing that you've understood the specification, the key terms in there, and actually linking your answers to the specification is a really good way of making it easier for you to get top marks, because that's how the mark scheme is going to be written, and it's going to be what the examiners are going to be looking for as well. So again, you can pause through this, have a look through, and what can you take for this for your own practice? So the final question, explaining the difficulties in assessing the value of radical technologies. Now there are lots and lots of radical technologies that we've talked about, but again, it's linking it into the specification and the key things that they mention. The issue with geography is it's always changing. So the specification written 4 or 5 years ago, and we're seeing new things coming through. But to help you get those marks, have a look at the specification where it specifically mentions carbon capture and storage and electric vehicles. and you know the difficulties in assessing them. It doesn't want you to describe and explain what they are. It's saying, you know, what are the futures, what are the issues about these different areas. And again, a really good opportunity for you to see a strong answer, where they've given lots of different ideas there, but they have talked about some of the issues with them, and it's kept really well focused onto the question throughout it. So as always, you can pause it, read through it. What are the bits that you could magpie or steal from it that you could use into your own exam practice? And as always, what to do next. The whole point of these assessments at the end of each inquiry question is for me to gauge if there are any major misconceptions, but also to work on your exam skills as well. So hopefully by looking through the marks that you've got in your feedback, and also by watching this video, you can recognize some of your weaknesses and act on improving them. You've seen the examples of good answers. You've got all of the resources on the Firefly pages, which has got all the information. It's got the links to wider reading as well. So if one of those issues is giving the examples, get onto those wider reading pages. Look at the newspaper articles and the videos and all the stuff that's on there to really help you understand all of this. So I hope you found that useful. Well done for keeping up the hard work, and see you soon.